Hello everybody.
Yeah, might as well.
We continue the series of our honored guest lectures, and actually it's a pleasure that we can have the honored guest lecture next to the commencement address, which Farid will pronounce tomorrow. We're supposed to be sitting in a more ornate hall, but there's an overflow of people, notwithstanding the fact that it's the middle of the summer, so everybody should be on the beach rather than here. So we moved to that hall. And what I wanted to say today is not the formal presentation which will happen tomorrow. Today we honor Farid as a scholar, and I think my biggest temptation was actually to always cast him as a scholar, because by the time I arrived on a postdoc at Harvard, I mean, if this city, as they say in Russian, every stone remembers Lenin, there are many stones. Нажать? Oh, okay. Okay, you can hear me now. Sure. Well, as I said, when I arrived on a postdoc at Harvard, if every stone remembers Lenin in this city of the three revolutions, there I had so many things said to me about Farid that at some point I thought, wow, this might be a very worthwhile career to go away from science into something he's doing. At the time, he was just an editor of Foreign Affairs. Now, as you know, after that, he became an editor of Newsweek, editor at large of Time, and right now, of course, he runs what we who grew up in the Soviet childhood remember as Международная Panorama, a 6 p.m. Sunday show on international affairs, which all the Soviet Union consumed as the only truth. Now, what I wanted to say right now is that actually it should be a déjà vu for Farid, because we're trying to force him back into his academic jeunesse. And today we'll try to follow, of course, the standards of a very fast and quick journalistic presentations. It's not going to be a TED talk, but something like that. Farid will speak for about 20 minutes on whether one can have too much democracy, of course, commenting on both the predicament of American and Russian politics. Then Serge Neman, who is a renowned journalist from New York Times, will be asking the first questions, effectively hosting him in the New York Times way on this renowned grilling of ours, and then the audience will be invited to join in the grilling. So, without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Farid. You can sit, you can stand, whatever.
I'll stand first.
Thank you so much, Oleg. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think I have to say I've been introduced many times in my life. I have been compared to many people, but never to Vladimir Lenin. So I regard this as a unique opportunity. I will try to take that as a compliment. And I leave it to all of you to tell me whether that's fair or not. I thought what I would do is very simple, because I'd like to get to the discussion with such distinguished people, which is to just make 3 points about this topic. The first is to outline what it is that I was arguing in a book and an essay many years ago about the idea that there can be too much democracy, and then to give you reflections on 2 examples since then, but not to talk about Russia, because I think, first of all, you know more about Russia than I do, and I'd like to hear your reaction, and also because that's what we will probably end up discussing more. So the piece that I wrote, the essay I wrote, was called The Rise of Illiberal Democracy in 1996 or 97, when everybody was celebrating how much democracy was spreading all over the world. And what I was struck by was the Yugoslav case, the case of what was going on in the former Yugoslavia, where you were holding elections and people were winning them, but the people who were winning were, in a sense, undermining what I thought of as democracy. And then I realized that really what we think of democracy in the Western world is 2 different traditions that have come together at the same time. One is the tradition of liberalism, constitutionalism, the rule of law, and the other is the democratic tradition. What do I mean by this? So if you look at Britain in 1850, Britain was generally regarded as the most enlightened place in the world, a place where individual freedom was most prevalent in Europe, where the courts were generally fair and balanced, where a human being could live a life in which he felt his rights were defined and protected by law. But do you know what percentage of the British population voted in 1850? About 2%. So it was clearly not a democratic system, but it was a constitutional liberal system. Even in the United States, by the way, only about 15% of the population voted in 1825. Until Andrew Jackson, it was maybe 10%, then it gets to be about 20%, because remember, no women, no slaves, and no foreigners of any kind often who had not come from a European background. So this distinction I was trying to make was that the West had been characterized by its liberal constitutional tradition much more than by its democratic tradition, which was very recent. So if you looked at Austria-Hungary, which was considered another place which was liberalizing, where there were increasingly rich civil society, but it was not democratic in any sense. Franz Joseph was an absolute monarch. And so on and so forth. You could see this distinction. Now what happens after World War I in the Western world is that you get a very quick movement toward democracy, toward full democracy, by which we mean universal adult suffrage. Every adult is able to vote. And so the two traditions come together, and each then reinforces the other, and we think that they are exactly the same. That when we talk about democracy, we mean the same thing. Independent courts, independent rights, freedom of speech, maybe even separation of church and state, and oh yes, everybody gets to vote. But my argument was these are two very different things. The reason it was important is I was saying, look at the world today, and what you're seeing is these two traditions which have fused in the West are actually decoupling, are unfusing, are coming apart in the rest of the world. So that if you looked at a place like the former Yugoslavia, you were seeing this phenomenon. You were seeing it in places like Slovakia, which had elected a very undemocratic, illiberal person as president at the time. You were seeing people who were being elected one time, and then beginning to undermine the system, such as Lukashenko. When I wrote it at the time, it was regarded as politically very incorrect, because it was a moment of great celebration of the potential of democracy. And I remember there were, for example, a cover essay in the New Republic denouncing me for being anti-democratic, and many, many such pieces, particularly, by the way, on the conservative side of the spectrum. Because at that time, you will remember, conservatism was dominated by neoconservatism in foreign policy, and neoconservatism was a celebration of democracy, the sense of the universalism of democracy, and the triumphalism of democracy. So democracy is good, it is what America should be promoting, it is spreading all over the world, and all this, anybody who says otherwise is obviously, anti-American, anti-democratic, and is trying to complicate this picture, this wonderful picture that we're painting. Then, in my opinion, now this is my partisan opinion of what happened, then Muslims start to vote. And all of a sudden, people's attitudes start to change. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that, extrapolating, fast forward to what you see happening in the Arab world, which I described in the book that I wrote after the essay very clearly. What you saw happening in the Arab world was a classic problem one can identify if you use this mechanism I'm describing. Because in the Arab world, you had, for really 2 generations, highly, highly repressive dictatorships that had in no way allowed any kind of civil society to grow, that had not allowed economic civil society, political civil society, and cultural civil society to grow. They had been aided by oil money, and made it very, very difficult for there to be any breathing room. But then these regimes, for a variety of reasons, start to crack, start to reform, pressured by the United States in some cases, obviously the Iraq War, and people start to vote. And guess what? They're not voting for Thomas Jefferson. They're not voting for liberalism. They vote on the basis of the ideas that they have at the time, which are largely pretty hardcore religious fundamentalist ideas. So the easiest example to look at is the place where nobody, certainly not the neoconservatives, contest that you had open, free, fair elections, and that is Iraq. So if you look at the 3 elections that have been held in Iraq since the American invasion, in the heart of Iraq, that is outside of the Kurdish area, where they are simply voting for Kurdish nationalists who can essentially de facto secede from Iraq. In Iraq itself, the majority of votes have been for hardline Shiite religious parties that are Iranian-inspired, Iranian-backed, and Iranian-supported. And if you look at the politicians who have become powerful and prominent, these are all people who come out of these 2 parties that are religious parties that were founded in Iran or in Syria when in the period of Saddam. And why is it that they are voting for these people? Because they regard these views as the most compelling, most powerful organizing views for politics. This is what they think produces a good society. This is not, some plot. I don't think there's any, secret Iranian plot here. It's just that when you put people in a situation where there is a total absence of a liberal tradition, total absence of a culture of civil society, what they look, they retreat to the organizing ideas they have, which are Islam, which are in many cases the subsector of Islam they come from, Shia versus Sunni, and of course the Sunnis themselves then have ended up voting for Sunni fundamentalists of various kinds, and when they have not voted, they have actually actively supported by joining ISIS or supporting ISIS. I mean, the heart of the problem in Iraq and Syria is that the Sunnis of Iraq and Syria regard as the only legitimate political expression of their representation is some form of hardline Islamic rule. They vote for these people, but because they are always outvoted by the Shia, they take to extra democratic procedures to get their representation, and that is through the support for ISIS, and before that for other kinds of insurgent groups. So what is interesting to me is that you see in Iraq and in Syria secondarily a perfect example of this. You saw it in Egypt, where again people now forget, but after the Egyptian revolution there were 3 elections within a 9-month period. There was an election for a president, there was an election for the parliament, and there was an election for the constitution. The Muslim Brotherhood contested all 3. They won all 3. So when people now say, oh, there are millions of people on the streets, yes, there was a bad government, and momentarily, as happens, so you can organize political passion. But in the way that we mean democracies, we understand democracies to work, which is consistent preferences expressed through democratic elections. You had 3 opportunities in one year, and in all 3 cases, the Muslim Brotherhood won. Now, they didn't win overwhelming majorities, but they won consistent majorities. If you look at other parts of the Muslim world, of the Arab world particularly, you see similar phenomena. And it's interesting to look at the one country where things are working, which is Tunisia. And in Tunisia, what you see is the Islamist party, the religious party, did actually get the largest number of votes, but it got about 35%, more than anyone else, a plurality but not a majority. And it ended up sharing power and actually then resigning from power. And so the system has worked better. Why? Tunisia is the only country in the Arab world where the dictator was highly secular and maintained that secularism to the end, unlike Saddam Hussein, who began secular and then became quite religious at the end. It's the only place which had very strong civil society, in particular unions and guilds. So there was a tradition of groups that were outside of the state and outside of the party, outside of the family. So there was some intermediate between the government and the individual. It was very close to Europe and had an economy that was dependent and therefore had connections and ties with Europe. The dictator was also very important, Bourguiba, in having always maintained a non-political army. So there was a whole series of issues that made Tunisia work better, and the final one I would say is you had enlightened political leadership from the Islamist party that was recognized that this problem that the Arab world has meant that if he tried to take wrest power on the basis of a 35% vote, the whole system would collapse. He would probably end up in jail, and there would be some kind of a return to power of the old guard. So if you look at Tunisia now, it's not a wonderful story. The old guard is in many ways back, but the new Democrats also have some power, and there's an uneasy alliance and an uneasy power sharing taking place amongst them all. So to me, this story of the Arab world tells you about this problem. Because the Arab world was basically in the worst place, I think, of all developing societies, because it was trapped between highly repressive dictatorships on the one side and illiberal democrats on the other side. And so it had a very difficult choice. And in Egypt, they literally went from choosing to go from a repressive dictatorship to illiberal democracy back to repressive dictatorship within a 3-year span. In Iraq and Syria, you are seeing a civil war because you cannot easily understand what to do. So when Mr. Putin says the solution is for Assad to come back to power and to take control, well, it's possible, but you would have to have a highly repressive regime, given that 80% of the country doesn't want him. But if you switched and did what the Americans would like and Assad to leave, you would have, in my view, a highly illiberal regime, probably on the style of something close to the Islamic State, if not entirely like the Islamic State. Because people don't really realize, if the Islamic State doesn't win, some other crazy group of these fanatics is going to win. And so that represents in perfect capsule form this dilemma. What to do in a country where you have trapped between repressive autocracy and illiberal democracy. So that has been, to my mind, the most interesting place in the world where these ideas have played themselves out. But another interesting place is the United States. So in a chapter in my book about illiberal democracy, I said, look, there's a very different kind of problem, but it's also an interesting problem that you're seeing in the United States, which is it is possible to imagine that you can have the democratic tradition getting too strong compared with the liberal constitutional tradition. And what I was pointing to was the ways in which American politics had been transformed over the last 35 years. So since really the 1960s and Watergate, what had happened in the United States was that many of the older Republican traditions of American politics had been eroded by democratic traditions. What do I mean by this? The simplest example is the primary system of nominating people for political parties. So for most of history, the way the Democratic Party and the Republican Party nominated people for president was the party elites would get together and they would decide who would be the best nominee from the Democratic side, the Republican side. They would put them up, and then you'd have an election. Then the people got to choose. And starting in 1964, people started saying, wait a minute, this is not very democratic. We should let the people choose. And so what started to happen was, over time, more and more states started to have primaries. And by about 1972-76, the system transformed completely, and it became one where the party elites simply watch while there is a prior election before the real election. So there's first the election on the Democratic side, election on the Republican side. It's even more complicated now because in many states, you can vote in the Democratic primary whether you're a registered Democrat, registered Independent, or registered Republican. So these are the so-called open primaries. So you have, the democratic system crushing the Republican system. Now, why do I say this is a problem? I am an Aristotelian. I believe that the best regimes have some mixture of all elements of political governance. For Aristotle, it meant mixing some element of aristocracy with some element of democracy. If you look at the old primary system, it was basically a system where, for the most part, elected officials, mayors, people who were elected at the local level, city councilors, state legislators, congressmen, senators, would choose who is the person who would best represent their party. Now remember, these are people who have all been elected by all the people. Because, to be a mayor, to be a state legislator, you are appealing to everybody, to a very broad group of people. Now what happens in the Democratic Party is only Democratic activists vote. So 20% of Democrats vote in a primary election, and those are the most extreme activist, hardline people. That comes to about 4% of Americans, of voting eligible Americans. So these are the people who are choosing the nominee. And on the Republican side, the same thing. So people think it's more democratic, but in a sense, it's actually less democratic because you have given over the process that was being essentially shaped by people who were elected by all the people. Instead, you're giving it to a very narrow slice, 4% of the American public, who are very extreme on either side. And you've lost control of the process because they can nominate whomever they want. And of course, you see that phenomenon right now on the Republican side because the system has essentially collapsed. Right? Donald Trump realized that the 4% on the Republican side, frankly, are crazy. And so he figured out a way to appeal to them by saying whatever it would take to have them support him. And the party is looking and saying, my God, how did this happen? What can we do about it? But they can't do anything about it because those Republican constitutional, if you will, constraints have disappeared, have vanished. Similarly, if you look at the functioning of the American Congress, it used to be that you had a very hierarchical system, again, drawn from the old aristocratic Republican tradition, which said, look, it's very good to have democracy, but you need the democracy to have some guidelines. And so committee chairmen are very powerful. The Speaker of the House is very powerful. The majority leader of the Senate is very powerful. This is how somebody like Lyndon Johnson, when he was majority leader, was able to steer and navigate enormous important legislation and changes through to essentially get rid of the whole system of discrimination against blacks in the United States. Well, in the 70s, what happens is, because of the reforms that take place after Watergate, they say, no, this is very anti-democratic. Every congressman, every senator should have equal power. And so every committee was made much less hierarchical. Congress was made much less hierarchical. And it was made all much more open and transparent. People thought this would be wonderful. It's been a disaster. It is, there's no question that Congress now functions much worse than it did in the old days. Why? Well, because if you want to get something done, now what happens is you have 50 congressmen in a committee. Every vote, every hearing, every proceeding is now open, transparent, recorded instantly, which means that all the special interests are watching every single congressman and senator, every word they say. So as a senator described it to me, he said in the old days, we'd go into the room, we'd basically figure out, we'd fight a little bit for our constituency, our funders, but we'd basically try to decide what was best for the country. We'd come to a compromise, and we'd get out of the room, and we'd each tell every one of our supporters, I tried very hard for you, but I couldn't do it. I'm sorry, we had to make a consent. He said, now you can't do that. Every vote is being watched. Every statement you make is being watched. So by losing the black box, the closed system, by losing that hierarchy, you have gained in democratic legitimacy, but the theory was, but you lose effectiveness, functionality, and the ability to actually get things done. Ironically, the result is, of course, Congress is now viewed more and more unfavorably by the American public, so that congressional approval ratings were actually quite good in the 1960s and 70s. 50%, 60%, 70%. I think the approval rating for the United States Congress right now is 8%. It is about where it is slightly higher than pest exterminators, insect exterminators and people like that. So it is about as low as it can get. And yet they look and say, well, we made it all much more democratic. So to my mind, it's a perfect example of the idea that you can have too much democracy. Now, I just want to end by saying something, which is I recognize, and I hope I conveyed this, each case is specific and individual, and you have to understand the history and understand, what the institutional and political path that it has taken. I would not argue that every country has too much democracy. I would argue that there are some countries where it is very clear there is too little democracy. But I think an interesting question for a country like Russia is, what is the crucial thing that you have too little of? Do you have too little liberty, or do you have too little democracy? And what is the path to getting to a better place in Russia? Is it to have more emphasis on liberal constitutional reforms? Do you want more independent courts? Do you want better protections for individual liberties? And if those could be provided by a somewhat enlightened czar, is that better? Or is it better to have more and more public participation, genuine democracy, more parties? I don't know the answer to that. Historically, as I say, in the Western world at least, what I can tell you is that the sequence was always first liberalization, first the build-up of the rule of law, build-up of protections of individual liberty, then democracy. Even if you look at a country like Germany, which was quite advanced, what you saw was, under Bismarck, under Wilhelm the First, and even Wilhelm II, it was this liberal tradition that was building up far more rapidly and effectively than the democratic tradition. The democratic tradition was, there's a mixed process. And I think in Russia, it is a complicated question because there's so many strains that we're talking about here. There is the westernizing strain, there is the Soviet strain, there is the imperial strain, and so I don't pretend that I have a simple answer as to what that question is, but I do think that is the fundamental question that Russia faces, that Russia has to ask itself. It is not going to take a pill and become liberal democratic tomorrow. And so what path you go on, it seems to me, is perhaps the most fundamental one that Russians have to ask themselves. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So, Serge, how do you want to do it? I mean, you will be just moving the mic in between you guys?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay.
Sure.
Thanks.
Or I can stand here if you like, or whichever. We can switch. We can alternate.
That was truly a fascinating description of how institutions and democracy are taking their separate ways and all the traditions. Before we came out here, we were sitting in Oleg's office talking about Russia, what's happening in Russia, and I'm sure there's a lot of the questions here about what's happening in America, and you've certainly addressed some of them. But in this separation of democracy and the institutional safeguards, is there not more than a threat just to the United States and to its own institutions, but also to the world? The American democracy was always the model for the world, as was the European democracy. And now I noticed when Vladimir Putin was speaking with you, he told you that American elections are not democratic. I wish you had a chance to answer him.
Yeah.
But he can now say that. The Chinese can argue that our democracy has become illiberal, that the Supreme Court is now paralyzed at 4-4. Congress votes purely tribally on every issue. Nothing Obama has done has had any support from one side. Trump is getting nominated. Are we not losing our ability to influence the direction of liberal democracy in the world because our own example is collapsing?
Yeah, it's a very good question because it's also not just happening in the United States. If you look at what's happening in Europe with the British right now, with the rise of the Le Pen, the nationalists in France, with the election of Orban and the way in which he is governing in Hungary, with the new Polish government, you are seeing this tendency toward illiberal democracy almost everywhere. Because at the end of the day, the British vote is entirely about immigrants and minorities. In France, the rise of Le Pen is all about immigrants and minorities. Orban is about that. The Poles, there's a large component of it that is about that. And what that is fundamentally illiberal, because it is about, in a sense, institutionalizing in some way a second-class attitude, a second-tier attitude towards others. And I think it's the most interesting challenge to modern liberal democracy we face. Because in the United States and in Europe, we had achieved a reasonably good balance between these two elements. And I think that two things have happened that have changed it. And they're both powered by the same reality, which is since 1989, the two great forces in the world have been globalization, and let's call it what it is really, the rise of global capitalism, and technological revolutions, and particularly in information technology. And what both of these do is they put an enormous amount of pressure on existing patterns of economic work and life. So you think about if you're a company, these two forces have been fantastic. Right? You look at Western companies and they can look around the world and they can say, where can I find cheap capital? I get the capital from there, let's say from Saudi Arabia. Where can I find cheap labor? China. I manufacture goods there. Where can I find a market that is strong and I'll sell into that market? Maybe the US today, maybe it's Australia tomorrow. That global arbitrage has been fantastic. But now imagine you're an average worker in the Western world. Those same forces are pushing down your wages, changing your life, constantly making you change jobs, change industries, change your entire model of social security. Because anything you do can be done by somebody in China at 10% of the price, or can be done by a machine at 10% of the price. Either way, you are in trouble, right? And this is the response, I think. What people have realized, and this is true in Europe and the United States. What is Trump's message? Trump's message fundamentally is very simple. He has lots of other craziness and he changes his mind, but his in one area, and his central message has been very consistent, which is your life is terrible. He keeps saying we're doing terribly, we're losing, we're in terrible shape. Your life is terrible and it's somebody else's fault. Whose fault is it? Mexicans, Muslims, Chinese, right? And that is the same message of Le Pen in France. It is the same message of the Brexit people in Britain. And that's a very powerful message. What it's saying to people is, yes, you have all these struggles, and it's somebody else's problem. And it breaks the model, the liberal democratic model, because what they're saying is these elites are doing things that are good for the companies, but they're not good for you. And it's interesting to me, the economic challenge is one so far Western democracies have handled quite well. A balance between trade and a safety net so that you have greater efficiency, but you compensate the losers. And I think they could still continue to do it if it just operated at the level of economics. But it has now moved to the level of identity. You see, the most powerful appeals of all these people, it's not really about money. It's who are you? It's who are these people who are coming here, who are not American, who are not French, who are not British, and they're changing our country. The most frequently heard refrain that you hear at Trump rallies is, I want my country back. So who's taking your country away? Right? And that's what this is a very powerful appeal to, and there's no real democratic answer to it. That's the problem,
Is there really no democratic answer? One thing I've admired about your TV show and your writings is that you're not ideological. You're much more analytical and closer to being a reporter. And yet you made some pretty passionate appeals to Republicans to tell Trump to stop, to roll back what he's doing. I mean, you spoke in terms that I don't usually find in your work. So you do seem to think that this can be rolled back, that there is a kind of a responsible elite that can drag this guy and slow him down a bit.
Yeah, no, I do think so, and partly you participate in the political arena as an intellectual or a political figure because you want to shape the debate. You're absolutely right. I think of myself really as an academic or more of an intellectual. I don't try to I don't think of myself as partisan, and I think of the role of my academic role as essentially a repertorial one, to explain, to present and explain. Sometimes you have to get up off you have to get off out of that position, because I think that what Trump represents, and I say this because I live in America, is very different. I got an email from a former Secretary of Treasury because I wrote this column and I made this commentary on my show saying, where are all the former Secretaries of State and the Secretaries of Treasury and the Secretaries of Defense? Where is George Shultz and James Baker and Hank Paulson and Condoleezza Rice? Are they, do they accept this man as their nominee? Why are they not denouncing him? And this guy sends me a thing saying, I've said some critical things about Trump. I've talked about how there's extremism on both sides. Bernie Sanders is, very extreme in his views, and Trump is very extreme. Now, let me be clear. I don't particularly agree with Sanders' views. I think that they are frankly very, very expensive, and it's sometimes easy to spend money you don't have, and I think that there's a danger to that. But I think that there is a fundamental issue here that we're not confronting, which is why I spoke out. Trump is not a normal candidate in that sense. Trump is somebody who began his presidential aspirations by suggesting that saying that the President of the United States was illegally in that office because he was in fact born in Kenya and was Muslim. He made this charge repeatedly, sent investigators to Hawaii, and this is a flat-out lie. And he continues it and has never renounced it. Then he, proceeded to make a series of lies about Mexicans, and then proceeded to suggest a kind of collective punishment for Mexicans in a way that no American candidate has ever done. Then he proposed the collective punishment of Muslims, whether it was registration, surveillance of them, banning 1.6 billion people from ever entering the United States. Then, in the meantime, he's also said that one of his opponent's father was involved in the plot to assassinate John F. Kennedy, Ted Cruz. All of these things, complete lies. He implied that Obama was not a Christian. He implied that Ben Carson, one of his running mates, was a child molester. He said that Mitt Romney was not really a Mormon, and besides, Mormonism is not really Christianity, is it? He just said this about Hillary Clinton 2 days ago. He said, we don't really know what she is as a, This is not normal politics. This is a kind of, demagoguery that the United States has not had. To have somebody who is repeatedly, almost pathologically, telling these lies, never retracting them, accusing people on the basis of their religion, on the basis of their race, on the basis of their, backgrounds, proposing collective punishments that the United States has never done since the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II. That's very different from coming out in favor of universal health care and free college tuition, which is what Bernie Sanders is doing. Now, as I say, I don't particularly agree with it because I don't think it'll work. But to have this former Secretary of Treasury say to me, there's extremism on both sides. No, there is an anti-democratic demagogue who will undermine the United States democracy, republic, and constitution on one side, and there's a pretty normal garden variety social democrat who wants to make America more like Denmark on the other side. Now you cannot claim these are equivalent, and that's why I felt it was important to get out of the position of just being a neutral observer.
I hope you're all preparing tough questions. Let me ask just one more. What you just said is very scary, but we've sort of gotten accustomed to being scared since Trump began running, and little by little, we're coming to grips with the idea that he might be president. I mean, before this year is out, we may have a demagogue as a president. Britain may be out of Brexit. The EU and NATO could be on their way to unraveling. Should we be scared?
Well, Mr. Putin maybe will not be so scared. He likes Mr. Trump, even though he claims he said he didn't say something. And I think that on that issue, which most of you probably saw repeated over and over again, I will simply point out that the Interfax translation, which I used, which is in other words the official Russian translation, did call Trump brilliant, but he also had two other words. He said extraordinary and talented. So maybe he also said what Oleg tells me the proper translation would be colorful rather than brilliant. But to call somebody colorful and talented is not to say that he is a bad person to my mind. You're still complimenting him. Maybe the compliment is slightly different than you meant, than your own translators translated it as, but it's still a pretty positive thing to say about Trump. The way I would put it is, look, I've gone through my life as an optimist, and maybe it's the life of an immigrant in America that you can have this very optimistic perspective. And so I will tell you this, I'm very worried, that's the reason I'm doing what I'm doing, but I don't think Trump will win. I don't actually think Britain will leave Europe, and maybe I'll be proven wrong tomorrow, but I actually think the margin of victory will be comfortable on the side of the Remain. I don't think Le Pen will be elected president of France. And I think when you look at the world, you have to remember these are very difficult forces that I was describing. If you think about your life as a steel worker or a car worker, your whole world has been turned upside down. That the world you grew up in doesn't exist anymore. And there are these other changes. Most of Western countries now are like the United States in terms of the number of foreign-born people that live in them. And you are going to have a lot of change and a lot of pressure, but what I'm heartened by is, so look at this. Yes, you have all these people we've been talking about. But who's the most popular politician in Germany? Angela Merkel, who said, I will take as many Syrian refugees as come to this country. Who is the Prime Minister of Britain, who won an absolute majority for the first time in 20 years? David Cameron, who wants to keep Britain in Europe. Who is the Prime Minister of Italy? Matteo Renzi, pro-market, pro-reform, left of center guy. And who is likely to be the President of the United States? Hillary Clinton. So we can sometimes forget that yes, there is a dark side to politics, but there are actually also a lot of people who are well within the mainstream. And again, you may like or dislike any one of these people for one or another thing, but they're clearly within this post-war consensus of trying to move these countries in a more positive, and I would argue, progressive tradition that, generally speaking, we would all hope the world goes in.
I feel relieved already, but if worst comes to worst, I'm sure Oleg would welcome you here as a professor.
Yeah. That's a good one. Well, I guess let me moderate them, and Sergey, if you'll give your phone to... Okay. I should warn from the start that I will be unfair, that is, I will favor the crowd from the university rather than the crowd from the city. So, gown is first, town is next. So, who wants to ask a question? Okay. Certified theories of democracy, and then Verko, please. Okay.
Thank you for this. I must say that I personally appreciate your book on the future of freedom very much. Always teach it as one of the core books in the democratic theory course. But there are elements in which I disagree. I think that your definition of democracy is still the definition of liberal democracy. So in a sense, you play liberalism against liberalism itself, but in a more democratic version. Because of course, when you say that in the Middle East voters support fundamentalism and this is democracy, yes, but first of all, this was parliamentary democracy brought by the American arms. Second, well, was there really a grassroots movement, or these people just came to candidates that voted? We in political theory know that actually until the 19th century, election was considered not democratic. It was an aristocratic procedure. And to some extent it's changed, but there is some truth to it. And this, when you were speaking, I thought, what would Vladimir Putin have said if he saw you again? Well, he would say, was this really the American mistake they tried to establish democracy and they failed? In Putin's mind, well, as he or his advisors, I more or less follow what they say. No, they think that's precisely what America wanted. America did build democracy, not liberalism, because it played parties against each other, it created a parliamentary system in these countries it occupied, in Russia too in the 90s. And what was the result? The result was civil war, because democracy works in this antagonizing way. And it's the more or less official doctrine of the Russian right wing that that's America's strategy, to establish democracy in these countries it occupies and splinter them. I'm not saying it is true, certainly this is not on the minds of policymakers, but I think there is some truth to the fact that this was an unintended result. So there are two things to weigh against each other. And that's more a comment, but I have a question. Policy guide.
Very short, please,
Very
yeah.
short. Do you think that the United States should reoccupy Middle East? Because that seems to be the only way out of this dilemma of liberalism and democracy.
Wow.
Well, both very, very intelligent observations and questions. Look, let me put it this way. I appreciate what you're describing, but think about it this way. The United States went into Iraq thinking that it would get very quickly a stable ally in the Middle East that was pro-American, anti-Iranian, and would be the world's third largest oil producer. In fact, what happened was the United States spent $1 trillion in pure cash. If you add in the amount of money it will spend on all these veterans, these military benefits, and I'm sure you have a version of this in the Afghanistan case, it will probably be $2 trillion. So the United States will have spent $2 trillion in Iraq. What it ended up doing was producing a pro-Iranian government that has been the single biggest advantage to Iran in the last 20 years. And it has also produced the strongest anti-American feeling in that whole region, because the Sunnis of both Iraq and Syria now think that the United States screwed them and deliberately engaged in this maneuver to empower the Shia, while the Shia think that the United States hates them because of Iran. So somehow the United States has managed to spend $2 trillion and have both sides hate it. I mean, you can see this very simply in the polling numbers. 90% of people in Iraq have a negative view of America. It's the highest in the Arab world. How you can do that after having, so-and-so liberated the place is mystifying to me. So I think that, sometimes there is a tendency in Russia, I find, to have conspiracy theories about everything. And this is a case in which even Russians will have to really struggle to explain how the United States benefited from this process, because it's surely it is the single most negative series of consequences for American foreign policy in the last 50 years, without any question. And to have, if we had planned it, we have very, very, very bad at planning. But your second question, which in a sense follows from that, I would argue, because if you're saying we have to reoccupy, it means that we have totally failed, which I agree with. But here's the problem, and it gets to the really central issue. When you have an area of instability, for whatever reason, and you're right that in the rapid introduction of democracy in ethnically or religiously divided societies is a big problem. And that was what we saw in Yugoslavia, that's what we're seeing in the Arab world, that's what we've seen anywhere where there are simple divisions that are on the basis of ethnicity or religion, because people cling to those divisions and vote on that basis rather than on any common purpose as a country. In those places, however, foreign forces, foreign influence is always regarded as illegitimate. And so it is very difficult for a foreign force to be a helpful force. I think that there are places like Japan, South Korea, where you have essentially ethnically homogeneous societies where you can play that role, particularly if there's an external enemy that they're worried about. But look at Afghanistan. The United States has, forget Iraq for a minute, the United States has been in Afghanistan for 15 years now. It's the longest war the United States has been involved in by far. We've spent another $1 trillion there. We have had 2 national elections. Both times the Democratic elected government has asked the United States to stay. But these are divided societies. The people who lose the election view that government in power in Kabul as totally illegitimate. They have mounted a military insurgency against it. They view the United States as essentially supporting this illegitimate government. It's a no-win situation. It's a situation where you cannot, find benefits. So the real answer in the Middle East, it seems to me, is you have to find a way to create legitimate local authority. Right? Legitimate local authority is the key. If you had really legitimate local authority in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, the United States can provide lots of aid and support and foreign aid and send in the World Bank and the IMF. The problem is there is no legitimate local authority. Not in my eyes. My eyes, these guys are all legitimate who've won elections. But my point is that the losers in that society don't view that as a legitimate process. They view, I remember being in Iraq just after the invasion, and I would talk to everybody and say, so you're going to have democracy? And all the Shia would say, yes, we are going to rule. And all the Sunnis would say, yes, you're going to have the Shia rule. And I would say, no, you don't understand. We are going to have a procedure by which there's... And both sides would say, yeah, no, we understand. It's now the Shia's turn to rule. And so what I realized was what I was describing in procedural democratic terms, they were describing in consequentialist, absolute terms, which is, we don't care what you call the process. We know what's going to happen at the end. The Shia will rule. And both sides agreed on that. The Shia with satisfaction, the Sunnis with horror, but that was the reality. Until you can break that mentality and you see that process as being one where even if you don't like the result, you abide by the process.
The result will be the same all the time.
Right.
Okay.
But the key is, one of the great shining moments of American democracy, in my view, and it's not viewed quite this way, is the Bush-Gore race. Why do I say that? Because frankly, it's a very complicated issue. I don't think it's as easy as anyone thinks. In statistical terms, it was a tie. Right? I mean, and somebody had to be decided the winner. I thought the Supreme Court did it the wrong way, but in any case, somebody had to be given the most important point is the loser accepted instantly and with enormous grace. Within 1 hour, Al Gore gave a statement and it said, Bush is the president, I wish him well. That is what you can't get to in the Middle East right now.
Okay. Well, it was Provost Vujicic and then Kevin Platt and then Steve. Okay.
The sociological underpinning about your argument about liberalism is the notion of an established elite. Historically, liberalism as opposed to democracy was upheld by English gentlemen, French civil servants trained in the Republican tradition, American wasps from the East Coast establishment. Those elites, and Gardner contrasted the established elite to the abstract elite. The abstract elite is recruited from many different social strata with different educational backgrounds, different cultural identities, and can't hold the center together, basically. So how does democracy, a liberal democracy, now recreate an establishment? How can we imagine a president like Bill Clinton today sending Richard Nixon to Moscow to find out what the other side thinks? How do we imagine a French election in which the socialists and the Chiracians get together to defeat Le Pen? And how does, in a multicultural world and with an open elite and a primary process you describe, how do we constitute that? Because that seems to me a key question. And if it's your Schumpeterian, more than Huntingtonian framework, I think high quality leadership is essential to a functional liberal system.
I think this is actually a very profound question, because it is true that the old liberal democratic system functioned on the basis of the elites you're describing. We do have elites now. There's no question we have elites. Think about the European Union. Think about look at the Supreme Court in the United States today. The Supreme Court of the United States, 8 people, I believe that with the exception of one, all of them have gone to Harvard or Yale Law School, right? So that is its own kind of elite. What we have today is a meritocratic elite. It is an elite based on merit rather than aristocracy, rather than bloodlines, rather than family. And while it is in many ways an improvement, it's very difficult and very complicated. And it produces a lot of problems. So, for example, this elite is not as secure, as impartial and as non-partisan. This elite believes it could lose its space, it could lose its slot at the top anytime, so it grasps. Give you a simplest example. Hillary Clinton's speaking fees. If you are running for president, and this is your lifelong ambition, and you have just been Secretary of State, and your husband is making $50 million a year speaking, can you not for 2 years just not make any speeches, or only make speeches to nonprofits? But no, the whole ethos of this meritocratic elite is, hey, it's a market system, Goldman Sachs is willing to pay me, why should I say no? If you look at Harry Truman when he left the presidency, he went back to his little town of Independence, Missouri. He asked everybody, please make sure of one thing, which is you call me Mr. Truman, not President Truman, because I'm not the president. It was an office I occupied temporarily, and I am now Mr. Truman. He refused to speak for money because he thought that was profiting off the office of the presidency. His Secretary of State, George Marshall, after whom the Marshall Plan is written, did not write his memoirs because he believed to accept an advance from the publisher would be to profit from government service. Because what would the memoirs be? He would be telling the stories about what he did in government. And that was an improper use of. So that was the old elite, right? Now people wonder why the new elite is viewed with greater suspicion and with less favor as the. And this is a genuine problem, which is people admire genuine aristocracy because people are not as grasping, they're not as money grubbing, they're not as self-centered. They have this long-term proprietary view of the interests of society because they know their position at the top is secure, right? So that's one great problem. The other great problem is we have a tendency to believe that people who are at the bottom in this society deserve it. What do I mean by that? In a meritocratic society, you say, well, I just got to where I am because I went to Yale, I went to Harvard, I got a scholarship. I then went and worked at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs. I didn't know anybody, I didn't have any, and so I managed to do well. I'm a CEO, I'm a billionaire, I'm an elected official because of my own merit. What does that mean about the people who didn't get there? It must be because of their lack of merit. So in a very strange way, we have unconsciously stigmatized the people at the bottom. And that, by the way, are Trump's voters. Trump's voters are white men who do not have college degrees. And what we all say is, look, you don't face any discrimination. You don't face any, why the hell are you not, why don't you have a college degree? Why don't you have a good job? Why didn't you retrain? So we have tended to have this view, which is that in a system where the movement toward the elite is natural and easy, the people who are at the bottom must be bad people. Or there must be somebody who it's okay in some way or the other to look down on. And what Trump, and to a large extent these other people that I've been describing, profit from, is that idea. So you listen to the Brexit campaign. Michael Gove, the main conservative leader of it, gave his powerful, passionate thing. He said the main reason to be opposed to Britain in the European Union is we are sick and tired of the experts. We hate being ruled by experts. They tell us everything. They tell us what is right. They tell us we don't need experts anymore. Now, at some level, this is absurd, right? This is idiotic. How are you going to get your economic analysis from a man on the street, from oracles, from consulting astrological charts? I mean, you are using experts because that's how modern society functions. But what he's tapping into is this problem of meritocracy and the elites.
Okay. Trustee Kevin Platt and then Steve Wayne. Okay.
Really enjoy the idea of.
Switch it on.
I think it's on.
It's on?
I can hear you.
Is it on?
Yeah.
I can speak loudly.
Yeah.
I really enjoy the idea of splitting liberalism and democracy, and I find the analysis very compelling. But it seemed like I wanted another factor thrown in, and that was maybe a different version of liberalism, or maybe simply we call it the economy. But it does seem to me like if you want to tell the story of the breakdown of American democratic processes over the last 30 years, you have to leave a place in it for neoliberalism. And then somehow you have to answer the question, well, what's the difference between the liberalism that you were speaking about, which is a liberalism of institutions, of values, of courts, and the liberalism of neoliberalism, which is a liberalism of markets, of market-driven conceptions of meritocracy. So what I would like to hear actually is maybe an additional factor in your analysis of the breakdown of this wedding between liberal values and democracy, either within the context of American neoliberal transformations of the relationships between elites and the populace, or Russia is a perfect test case for a discussion of what goes wrong when you don't think about the economy and you introduce so-called free market democracy.
Right. I think it's a very good question, and I think that the key here is to understand what work is liberalism doing in my model. The work that liberalism is doing is it is providing a check on absolute power. It is providing for the building up of civil society. It is providing for a system in which people are treated more equally and their rights are protected. Historically, the market economy and trade actually were very positive features, because the market economy, more than anything else, is what destroyed the old feudal aristocratic tradition. In this regard, I am a Marxist, in that Marx, I think, perfectly well understood how the rise of capitalism destroyed the old feudal system, destroyed the aristocratic system, destroyed the old religious hierarchy, and created a new bourgeois elite that was able to, in many ways, transform and modernize these societies much, much faster. Now, after that, Marx becomes more of a polemicist, and he tells you what he wants to happen rather than. But Marx, as a social scientist, I think is a very powerful explanation of the role that capitalism played in destroying the old order, which was very much an order based on birth, bloodlines, nobility. And I think as long as the market plays that role, it actually it strengthens liberalism and constitutionalism and the rule of law. The problem is, and I think people who are free market advocates and libertarians and neoliberals don't recognize this often enough, is that the market often fails. And what you have seen in the last 30 years in the Western world is not actually, even though it is described often as rampant neoliberalism, it has been a very distorted and corrupted version of neoliberalism. So that what has happened in the United States is you have increasingly capital gaming and rewriting the rules of the political system to benefit itself, to benefit particular industries, to benefit certain sectors, to benefit companies, to throttle competition. So there's very good analysis now that shows that the American capitalist system is today less competitive than it was 30 years ago. The Economist had a whole special report on this subject explaining exactly how you can measure this. The number of startups are declining, access to capitalist, because basically economic power had been able to influence political power and rewrite the rules to benefit it. Perfect example of this is how the financial industry has been able to change tax laws so that you have people who make money in the financial world are taxed, as if their gains are capital gains versus income, and that's 20% rather than 50 or 40%. But there are thousands and thousands of those kind of changes. So I would argue that distortion produces a kind of crony capitalism. And in many, many places in the world, what you're seeing is that crony capitalism. Now that is, I think, extremely harmful, because not only does it not play the role I was describing, it doesn't produce pluralism, it is not a check on power, it does not provide equality under the law, but it takes the power of capitalism and into its engine, and capitalism is very powerful. So these forces get more and more strong, and that is one of the reasons, not the only reason, why you see this dramatic rise in inequality. Because all of a sudden, historically in the West, people gained economic power because they wanted political power, which was okay. The Roosevelts of the world. Historically in the East, people gained political power because they wanted economic power. And that was always thought to be more corrupt. You became the mayor because you wanted to become a rich man. Whereas in America, you became a rich man because you wanted to become the mayor. But now what you see happening is a feedback mechanism, which is dangerous. Which is, in the West, you have people with economic power who are finding ways to gain enormous political power and have no responsibility. So they have power without responsibility, which is a very, very dangerous combination, I think.
Okay, Steve Wayne, and then Alexander Kurylov. Okay, Steve is here. No, Masha, what? Steve.
What country at what point in time do you think got the balance of democracy the best, and why?
I think that the United States, by the 1960s, 70s, had managed to solve the principal problem that America had in its democratic system, which was the disenfranchisement of blacks. And I think that at that point, perhaps as always happens, what people don't realize is how powerful a shift that was. People in blacks in the United States had been living in quasi-serf conditions in the South. And what it took to break that was so powerful that the system overreacted, in my view. Because if you say, elites, Republican, what people would say to me, I think if they were in 1961 in America, was, this is the system that has allowed the Senate to block any reform of civil rights for 100 years. This is why the South today doesn't look that different from the South in 1875, right? And so in order to break that system, people felt like they had to break the procedures that made that system, and I think they overdid it. I think that most Western countries have managed a pretty good balance. I'm not somebody who believes in doom and gloom. The question, I think, is we have not figured out how to deal with this new problem. And this new problem being, I should have explained. So it's the technology and globalization totally transforming the world, while at the same time globalization has made it inevitable that you have mass migration. And you have new people coming into your countries, all of these countries. And it's that combination we have not figured out how to deal with. Look, as I say, I'm an optimist. I think ultimately we will figure it out. And the American system, it always finds a balance. It always corrects. So while the things Serge was saying are true, I look at America and I say, yeah, there are many problems. But if you look at it after the financial crisis, it responded better than any other country. It managed to recover faster than any other country. It's elected a black man as president, seems to be about to elect a woman as president. The most powerful economic official in America is a woman. For all its problems, it has managed to get a lot of things right. The problem with America is a very messy, chaotic system. And you'd never want to point to it at any given moment. America is like a movie, it's not a snapshot. You take any snapshot and it's chaos. But if you watch the movie, the good guy seems to win at the end.
Wow, Russian movies are about a different thing. Alexander Kurylov and then Steve Hansen, okay.
Speaking about occupations, there was a joke, quite fairly popular in Russia, right after the events in Crimea. There were certain Russian tourists coming to the border of some European country, and they were asking, police authorities were asking a question about their surname, their occupation, and the Russian tourists basically answered, no, just tourism. And this event basically affected quite significantly the image of Russians abroad, and quite significantly, of course, affected the situation with the investments to Russia. And I just want to come back to what Vladimir Putin told you about Trump and how he can be changed when he gets power, and how he can be maybe can become entirely different politician. So could you, as analyst, assess what would be what happens? I understand you're optimist and everything, but if he comes to power, what would be your scenario?
Look, I'll be totally honest. I think that he might well turn out to be a lot better than I'm describing, because the truth is he has no ideas about any of these things. He has no...
Could you take the power in your hands and order them?
Послушайте, я заранее предупреждал, что люди из зала не будут выступать.
That in this call they do not let other people ask the question or give you any information.
Well, it would not be a good democracy if we did not have protests. So I think I appreciate it. I'm not setting the rules, but I think you've made your point. On Trump, I don't think we know what he thinks, because the truth of the matter is, the problem with Trump is, I don't think he knows anything. So you look at Brexit. No, I mean, you have to actually watch the TV, when he's asked these questions. So he was asked about a question about Brexit. And he looks at the guy and he says, what do you mean? He said, Brexit, exit? And he said, the reporter says, no, Britain leaving the European Union. Why would it leave the European Union? So somebody says to him, there is this referendum in Britain that is going to leave the European. And he says, oh yes, I think it should leave. Now, does anybody really think he has any views on the subject? The guy tells him he has no idea. He doesn't even read the newspaper, so he doesn't even know that there is Brexit, and he has to quickly on the spot come up with an opinion. But that's true with all these things. I'll give you an example. He was asked about. He said the U.S. is being fleeced by its allies. They're ripping us off. They don't pay for anything. We defend them. So Wolf Blitzer on CNN, you can watch this, asks him, you know that the United States does not pay for everything, that South Korea, for example, pays 50% of all the costs of of housing American troops. He says, how much? Wolf says 50%. Pauses for a minute, he says, why not 100%? This is like, you know what's going on. He's like quickly trying to think, what do I say? And so he says, well, why not? It's like a real estate deal. You offer me a 20% discount, why not 30%, right? I mean, I can get this for less. So then Wolf says to him, but that's a lot, and you know that a lot of people say that if you were to bring these people back to America, it would be more expensive to house them in America than to keep them in South Korea. South Korea's per capita GDP is 15,000, America is 55,000. So obvious, right? He says, well then why do we need them? Maybe we should get rid of them. But 2 days earlier, he had given a speech saying he was going to increase the number of American troops, not decrease them. So the whole thing is chaos, right? I mean, he's just, again, one of the things that makes it important to realize he's not like a normal candidate. He doesn't even bother to prepare. It would take him 20 minutes to have somebody brief him on these issues before debate. He doesn't bother, right? So when you say what would his attitude be, I mean, I think the honest answer is, who the hell knows, right? Because he doesn't know anything about any of these issues. So it's possible that he will, from the Russian point of view, be more realistic and pragmatic and say, I can cut a deal with Putin. It's quite possible he'll meet Putin once and just doesn't like him and say, I'm going to screw you. I'm going to make your life 10 times more difficult. You have no idea which of the he'll do. I mean, what I know about him is all the things he campaigns on most hard, which is I'm going to build a wall and Mexico will pay for it, is not going to happen. I'm going to deport 11 million illegal aliens, not going to happen. I'm going to stop 1.6 billion Muslims from coming into the United States, not going to happen. And those are his main policy proposals. So he's in a sense a kind of stealth candidate. Like he's a secret Manchurian candidate because you don't really know what he'll do, since all the things he says aren't going to happen.
Okay, Steve Hansen, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this fantastic discussion and presentation. So I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I wonder a little about the phrase too much democracy. And I wonder if you worry a little bit that that can quickly be misused. So if we think about someone like Sisi in Egypt, who would be very happy to say, yes, way too much democracy, and now we're getting rid of that, we've corrected course. I can think of innumerable examples of people you wouldn't particularly want to endorse. So it's not as jazzy to say that what you're interested in is finding a way in the 21st century globalization context to build functioning, inclusive state institutions. But I think that's what you're really, sort of back to Kevin's question about the next dimension. I think it's a little bit dangerous to have that dichotomy of order or rule of law and democracy, because that actually sort of encourages an oscillation in many of these countries. If you don't get, extremist voting and ruining democracy, you get a kleptocratic autocracy instead, which is no better and actually breeds, the same cycle. So I was wondering if you would be willing to retreat a step from the too much democracy trope.
It's a very smart point. The editor of The Economist, legendary editor of The Economist, Jeffrey Grazer, once said, the two rules of journalism are simplify and then exaggerate. And I think that what I'm doing there is being a good journalist. You're absolutely right. The great danger, and that's one of the reasons one of the reasons I called the book The Future of Freedom, not Too Much Democracy or even Illiberal Democracy, was I wanted to convey that the place we're trying to get to is a democracy that respects individual rights and supports constitutional procedures. But that's a very complicated idea. And, sometimes you want to get across one simple idea, which is that there can be such a thing as too much democracy, and that is so controversial that people pay attention. I'm hoping that people then look below the headline and understand. But you're absolutely right. Now, you raise one interesting issue which I don't know the answer to. Which is better? If you had a reactionary, repressive dictatorship, or you had a thoroughly illiberal democracy in the long run? Which can over time yield, and I think you could make the case that actually the democratic one is probably the better one in the long run, because at least there's change. There's a process by which you can imagine maybe these guys are not good, but at some point they get voted out and somebody else comes in. And so there is at least some mechanism for change. The problem with an authoritarian system is you kind of have to wait for the guy to die, and that's a long, long time to wait for progress.
Okay, Harley, please. No. And then Ivan. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. I'm Harley Walser from Georgetown University. Actually, I wasn't going to ask this at Steve's question, I really made me want to follow up. Is America's problem too much democracy or too little democracy? Steve Fish has done some really interesting work on what he calls the Parliamentary Powers Index. Your list of the three countries, Merkel in Germany, France, Cameron in England, are parliamentary systems. The American system, we think we're really democratic. If the president messes up, you can't do anything about it until the next election. A parliamentary system you can change. And I'm wondering if it would be worth thinking about this problem. Are the parliamentary systems really, they're more democratic, but they also seem to be more sustainable?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think, as you know, there's a long historical literature on it. I would think that these things are so complicated in the sense there are so many variables involved that if you want to look at a simple question of success, I would certainly argue that over the course of the 20th century, American presidential democracy has been more successful than German parliamentary democracy, especially if you allow me to throw in the 20s and 30s as part of the data set. But I think that the way I would put it is they each have different advantages and different disadvantages. And I don't deny the disadvantage the American system has, but they do have some powerful advantages as well. The president is elected by all the people. He is able to function in a way that allows for that kind of unifying tendency. Parliamentary systems have historically been more unstable, which is why they have to play around with these minimum requirements all the time. If you look at Israel, for example, which is a parliamentary democracy, it strikes me as basically the worst functioning democracy in the world, and precisely because it is very democratic.
But then you never would have had Hitler if you hadn't had Hindenburg to appoint somebody without a majority as a chancellor.
Well, as you know, it's a very complicated situation. Basically, if it didn't have the Great Depression. If people forget, before that they had 10% of the vote. Once you get to 30% of the vote in a parliamentary system, that's generally a pretty strong.
We have to finish. I'm sorry, Rich. And there was Jack Sharp was raising his hand for a long time, but then there's Ivan Kurila. You guys decide who is the last one. Well, we can do it in tandem, like Putin and Medvedev.
You can both do it, no problem.
Thank you very much. I would like to join my colleagues in saying a fascinating presentation. We really appreciate you coming here. As I think the only Brit in the room, I have to ask about Brexit. I wish I shared your confidence. I'm feeling quite nervous today, to be honest. But the question I would ask is that given the debates that it has brought forward, and given the space that has opened up for populism in the UK in the run-up to this referendum, do you think that actually calling a referendum on the issue was the right thing to do? And in that regard, is Britain suffering from too much democracy right now?
Can I get the second question?
Sure.
Ivan, please, your question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, thank you very much.
This is a professor of history of Russian-American relations, so he knows everything.
Something about the history of Russian-American relations. You mentioned that the best period for American democracy was 60s and 70s, and I cannot stop me thinking that it was a high time of Cold War. And my question would be, can you try to connect your idea to the Cold War? Was the Cold War the incentive for American elite to keep democracy and liberalism in line? And was it the end of the Cold War? Was it one of the reasons of the mess we have now? Can you? Thank you.
On Brexit, I think you asked the fundamental question, which is should this have been subjected to a referendum? And it's a perfect, actually I hadn't even thought about this, but it is a perfect example of the issue that I'm raising. So Britain has a very strong, very old parliamentary tradition, and the parliamentary tradition is you elect people to parliament, they choose a majority, and then they govern the country. You do not constantly ask the public what it thinks about. You don't take the temperature of the public all the time. If you remember, one of the most famous statements of any British politician ever was Edmund Burke addressing his constituents when he was told, you have to support this bill because the people want it. And he said, the people have elected me to exercise my judgment. If they want to govern, they should get rid of me. I'm going to exercise my best judgment. Now, I think that the reason I believe in that, and I believe that David Cameron made a terrible mistake, and by the way, this was not some great act of statesmanship. He was trying to very cleverly defang or put in place the conservative opposition that he faced, and who were mostly Eurosceptics. So this was not some great democratic theory behind it. He was just trying to outmaneuver people and said, oh, yeah, we'll hold a referendum, and then he got stuck with it. But the reason it's a bad idea is, look, in every society, people have passions, and there are moments frankly, of madness. I don't know how many of you remember, because it was a small moment. There was a time at which the United States was going to allow the Dubai ports to operate the Los Angeles port system. The Dubai ports is a very efficient, professionally run operation out of Dubai. And after 9/11, people said this will mean the terrorists will be in charge of our port system. And it was completely crazy, because really what the Dubai ports was going to be given was like, imagine if Emirates Airlines has one of the buildings, the terminal buildings in an airport, which by the way they do have in many countries around the world, they operate, many foreign airlines operate like that in the United States. But this was a crazy period. Everybody had to come out and say they were against it. Every politician you've ever heard of said, oh, terrible idea, because it was polling at 80% against. Similarly, you had the mosque that was going to be built 4 blocks away from 9/11. Everybody said this is a terrible idea. It was crazy. In the United States, which is based on freedom of religion, somebody is building a mosque on private land that just happened to be 4 blocks away. It was not some kind of conscious statement they were making. This is where they got the land, and it was shut down, right? These moments of passion take place. The problem with this kind of highly over-democratic process is you give in to them, and then you're stuck with them, and then you have transformed the country because you listen to people's momentary, temporary, passing passion on something. It passes. People are crazy, and then these things subside. These passions come down. But the process of, there's too much democracy, if I can continue to use my politically incorrect phrase, means that you institutionalize these moments. And that is really what Cameron is in danger of having done. People right now, because of the migration issue, because of ISIS, because of Syria, there's a heightened sensibility about this. It'll pass. 5 years from now, we'll be in a very different place. But because of Brexit, 5 years from now, the world might be different because of what David Cameron did. On the second question, I think you're absolutely right. If you listen to the civil rights speeches of people like Hubert Humphrey, some of the great leaders of civil rights movement, they would often say, how are we going to explain to the world that we are the leaders of freedom and we are the leaders of democracy if they come to us to the South and they see how we treat African Americans? How can we explain to the world that we are leaders of freedom if our Senate does not function properly? And there was this constant sense of having to put your best foot forward. So you raise a very interesting problem, which is, I don't know that we have reached the end of history. I don't know that I agree with Fukuyama, though there was something very profound he was onto, which was the idea that liberal democracy has lost any powerful sense of competition. I see this when I teach, occasionally I'll still do a lecture here or there, and I did when I was at Foreign Affairs. I was teaching at Columbia for a bit. And the thing that I was struck by was to try to explain to students today what the world of the Cold War was like is impossible. Because that was a world in which people thought that history was going in 2 possible different directions. There was a bet on the direction of history. Every country was trying to figure out, am I going to go in is history moving in the Soviet direction or the American direction? And that sense, much more even than the fact that the world might be blown up and all this, that was a very powerful organizing force for people. And it made people very conscious of American democracy. Now, there were lots of excesses as a result, McCarthyism, the witch hunts, all that. But there was a high stakes game. Today we live in a different world. There is no such sense that the people are trying to figure out the direction of history. History may not be moving. It may be kind of a little crazy. It may be unfair, which is what a lot of the Bernie Sanders people, say. But nobody thinks there is some other direction it's moving. People try to scare us all with the Islamic fundamentalism and Sharia and all that. But it doesn't work, because the nature of Islamic fundamentalism by definition is limited to Muslims, first of all. So for the other 5 billion people in the world, it has no appeal, right? There is no chance any non-Muslim is going to say, I want to live under Sharia law, right? And even within the Muslim world, what we know from looking at 50% of the Muslim world holds elections regularly, none of them want to live under it. So even though we try, the reality is we live in this world where there is no real competitor to liberal democracy, and that produces, that does mean you live at a heightened sense of the importance of putting your best foot forward, developing, your capacity to the best. I mean, the United States went to the moon entirely because it wanted to show the Soviet Union that it could do better than it. No other reason. We know it if you look back on the documents now. That sense we have lost. And so, if you were to, is there some new a situation that could infuse us with the same sense. There are some friends of mine in Europe who say, if you look at Orban, if you look at the Polish situation, you are seeing a new kind of nationalist authoritarianism. And maybe that is the danger. But it's not it doesn't have the same ideological, systematic appeal that communism had, where any country, any person, anywhere was susceptible, could be converted, where any society could move in that direction. And so I think we have to all admit, as students of politics, life is less interesting than it used to be. It's much better, but it's less interesting.
Okay, let me wrap it up maybe by saying a couple of words in your style, which is simplify and exaggerate, right? I love it. I know where I'm going to go after I stop from this podium after 2 years of stopping being a rector. Now, 2 vignettes first. The first one is very simple. It's about the way many parents of my generation felt in this country. Democracy means there's 1,000% inflation in a year and you lose all your life savings in 1 year. Would you like to have more democracy like that? The answer is obvious. Another one was spoken from here by Ron Engelhardt, who came from University of Michigan and gave us a class in world values. And he was telling how deficient Russia was in the index of democracy. And we asked, what's number one in the latest survey of 77 countries? He said, you won't guess. Everybody said Sweden. He said, no. He said, Denmark. He said, no. And he said, what? He said, Albania. Everybody kind of said, why? And the answer is, it's a different understanding of democracy. As my former Yugoslav friends immediately said, democracy in Albania means we're all moving to Italy tomorrow. So basically, that was the story. But I'm not about different interpretations of democracy. I'm about the fact that I think you mentioned one thing which might be offering the same kind of hope which communism was offering as an alternative to liberal democracy. And the alternative is not illiberal democracy. The alternative you mentioned is you like it, but you never developed, which is mixed government. Liberal democracy is representative government. It's parliaments and it's participation through elected delegates. Mixed government, it's not about delegates, it's about a bit of monarchy, quite a lot, a bit of aristocracy, and only a bit of democracy. And that's what stops maybe the excesses of democracy in a sense. If you had a bit of aristocracy right now, it would stop Trump right away. The fact that the party aristocracy is gone in America. If we had more aristocracy in this country, I mean, Putin would not be such a plebiscitarian ruler he is. So in a sense, don't you think that actually the alternative is called republicanism rather than communism right now?
Yeah, it's a version of what I was saying, yes. But thank you all very much.
Okay.